The letter had not mentioned the cold. It had mentioned the position. Housekeeper, it said, for a working farm outside of Moose Jaw. And it had mentioned the wage, which was modest but fair. And it had mentioned that the previous arrangement had ended abruptly and that he needed someone who could start before the ground froze. It had not mentioned that the road from the station would be 4 miles of rutted clay, or that the man who was supposed to meet her at the platform would not be there, or that she would walk the last 1.5 miles carrying her own trunk by the handle until the handle broke, and then by her arms the way you carry a child you are too tired to hold properly. She set it down at the gate. The gate was not latched. It hung open on one hinge, the post beside it, leaning at the angle of a man who has had too much to drink and not yet decided to fall. Beyond it, the yard was a catalogue of things left unfinished. A wagon with one wheel missing, propped on a stump. A split-rail fence that had split beyond its usefulness along the west side. Firewood stacked against the house wall, but not enough of it, and what was there had not been covered, and the top layer was dark with moisture. She stood at the gate for a moment. The sky was the color of old tin. The wind came off the flats from the northwest, the kind of wind that does not gust, but simply presses, steady and impersonal, as though it has somewhere else to be, and is moving through you on the way. She picked up her trunk and carried it through the gate. The door to the house was unlocked. She knocked anyway, waited, then opened it. The kitchen was dim. The fire in the stove burned down to coals, the room cold enough that she could see her breath. There was a pot on the back of the stove that had been there long enough for the contents to dry and begin to separate from the sides. There were dishes in the basin that had been left to soak. Some days ago, the water gone gray and still. A chair had been pushed back from the table at an angle, as though the person sitting in it had stood up in a hurry and not come back. She crossed to the stove and opened the firebox. The coals were still alive. She did not take her coat off. She fed the fire first, the way her mother had taught her. Shavings, then kindling, then the small rounds, patient, not asking for more than the fire was ready to give. When it had caught, she put the kettle on, and then she stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the room the way she looked at most things. Not to judge them, but to understand what they were telling her. What the room was telling her was that the man who lived in it had been managing, once. The shelves were organized, flour, salt, dried beans in their proper jars, a row of preserves that had been put up with care, the lids sealed, the labels written in a careful hand. Someone had known how to keep a house. The disorder was not old. It was the disorder of a man who knew how things should be and had stopped doing them, which is different from a man who never learned. She heard him before she saw him. The door from the back room opened and he stood in the frame of it, and she understood immediately that she had come at a difficult time for him, though she could not yet say why. He was somewhere past 40, lean the way men get lean when they forget to eat, with a beard that had grown past the point of intention. His left shoulder sat lower than his right by a margin that told her it had been broken at some point and healed imperfectly. He was looking at her the way people look at things they expected and did not prepare for. He said, "You're here." She said, "Yes." He said, "The road was all right?" She said, "The road was fine." She did not mention the trunk or the gate. These were not complaints. They were simply facts, and she had no use for telling a man his problems back to him on the first day. He said his name. She said hers. He asked if she wanted tea, and she said the kettle was already on. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. And then it was gone, and he sat down at the table, and she found the cups and made the tea, and they sat across from each other in the cold kitchen with the fire beginning to warm the room by degrees. And he told her what the place needed, which was everything. And she listened and did not look at him with pity, which she understood he would not have been able to stand. She found the problems in the order they announced themselves. The barn roof had a gap on the northeast corner where the boards had lifted in a summer storm and been repaired badly, the nails driven at an angle that would not hold through a Saskatchewan winter. The milk cow, there was only one, a dark roan with a white blaze and a disposition of long suffering, had not been dry-lotted properly, was losing condition, and had developed the beginning of a problem with her right rear quarter that would become serious if left another week. The kitchen garden had been let go to quack grass and pigweed, though the soil under it was good, darker and richer than the surrounding clay. The root cellar was 3/4 full, which surprised her. Someone had worked hard in the summer. The potatoes were sound. The carrots were still firm. There were cabbages and turnips and 2 bushels of dried peas, and enough to last through to April if they were careful, more than enough if they were not. She noted all of this without writing it down. She had always kept her accounting in her head. On the 3rd morning, she was at the barn before light, which was when you needed to be. And when she came back in with the milk, he was standing at the stove with his back to her. And she could see from the way he was standing that he had slept badly and that this was not unusual. The coffee was already made. He poured a cup for her without asking how she took it and set it beside her on the table. And she understood that he had been watching how she moved through his kitchen, cataloging her the way she had cataloged the root cellar. And she found she did not mind. She said, "The board on the northeast corner of the barn roof needs to come down and go back up properly before the first heavy snow." He said, "I know." She said, "The cow needs attention to her right rear quarter. I can do it if you show me where you keep the salve, or you can do it, but it needs to happen today." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not telling you things you don't know. I'm telling you what order to do them in." He said, "All right." There was a silence. He said, "You're not what I expected." She picked up her coffee. She said, "What did you expect?" He thought about it. He said, "I'm not sure I thought that far ahead." She supposed that was honest. She let it be. She learned the farm the way you learn any language. Slowly at first, then all at once. The rhythms of it settled into her body the way rhythms do when you have been paying attention. The cow let down her milk more easily after the 2nd week. The hens began to lay again after she fixed the gap in the coop where the cold had been getting in. The barn roof got done on a Sunday, when the weather held clear, the 2 of them working without much talking, him on the roof and her below, passing boards up. And she thought it was probably the most useful she had felt since the previous spring. She did not think about the previous spring any more than she could help. There was a grave at the far edge of the property, set back from the poplar brake. She had seen it on her 3rd day, a simple wooden marker, the inscription weathered but still legible, a woman's name, a date 3 years back. She had not mentioned it. He had not mentioned it. She supposed there was nothing to say about it that was not already understood. She had her own losses. She did not carry them in front of her. What she knew about grief was that it takes up the space of the person who is gone, not as a presence but as a shape. You move around it. You do not run into it mostly because you have learned where it stands. But sometimes you reach for something that should be there and it is not. And that is when it catches you. In the small, ordinary moments, in the kitchen, in the half-dark before the fire catches, in the few seconds between waking and remembering. She thought this might be what the farm looked like from the outside. Not neglect, grief in the shape of neglect. She kept this thought to herself. In November, a man came from the next property east, a cheerful, thick-shouldered man named Burrell, who seemed to take up most of the doorframe. And he said he had heard there was a woman working at the landry place, and he wanted to make sure everything was above board. He looked at her when he said this with an expression she had seen before, the kind that is meant to look concerned but is mostly curious. She told him everything was above board. He asked if she was comfortable out here, this far from town. She asked him if he was comfortable this far from his own property. He laughed at that, and she thought he was probably not a bad man, just one who was used to knowing everyone's business and considered it a form of neighborliness. After he left, she stood in the kitchen and listened to the quiet and thought about how the people around a situation always understand it less clearly than the people in it. The man, she had started to think of him simply as the man, which is what he was. No more or less than that, had been in the barn when Burrell came. She did not know if he had seen the wagon. She did not go looking for him to tell him about it. What happened on this property was not a story for other people's benefit. It was just a life, the same as any other. December came in hard. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that changes the quality of the air, makes it sharp and crystalline, gives sounds a different quality, brittle and close. The cattle. There were 11 of them. A small herd, mixed breed, the kind of cattle you keep when you are working with what you have rather than what you planned. Needed extra attention. needed the ice broken in the water trough twice a day, needed the barn bedded deeper than usual. She did this without being asked because it needed doing. She did not resent the work. Work had been her companion for long enough that she was on good terms with it. One evening in the middle of December, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, with a ledger open in front of him and his hands flat on the table on either side of it, not writing, just sitting. And she understood that the numbers were not good. She poured 2 cups of tea and sat down across from him, and he closed the ledger and she did not ask him to open it again. She said, "What are you short on?" He said, "Everything is a place to start." She thought about this. She said, "The cattle are sound. 11 head going into winter in reasonable condition is something." He said, "If we lose the hay supply in the back quarter," she said, "we're not going to lose the hay supply. The fence along the north side needs work, but it's workable. I can walk it tomorrow." He looked at her. She said, "I walked fence before. It's not particular to this place." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you here?" She understood this was not a question about the job. She said, "Because the letter said you needed someone before the ground froze, and the ground was getting ready to freeze." He said, "That's not the whole of it." She said, "No, it's not, but it's the part that's yours to know right now." He looked at her steadily. He did not push it. She had noticed this about him, that he understood the difference between a thing withheld and a thing refused, and he did not press on a closed door. She found this more unusual than she had expected. The fire settled in the stove. Outside the wind had come up, and the window above the basin was black and loud with it. She said, "We'll get through winter. After that we can talk about what the place needs." He nodded once. He reached for his tea. She supposed that was as close to an agreement as 2 people like them were likely to come to. It seemed like enough. She walked the fence line the next morning in cold that made her eyes water and her breath come in visible clouds, and she found 4 places that needed attention and fixed 2 of them on the spot with what she'd brought, and marked the others with strips of red rag from her coat pocket. The back quarter was in better shape than the ledger had implied. The hay in the field shelter was stacked high and well protected by the roof of the structure on 3 sides. Someone had done this right. Someone had planned ahead. She thought about the row of preserves in the root cellar, careful labels in the careful hand. She thought about the grave at the edge of the property. She thought about what it would mean to do all of that, plan for every winter, put up every jar, stack every bale, and then not be there for it. She walked the fence line and did not cry, but she understood something about the man that she had not understood before, which was that he had spent 2 years living inside a future that someone else had prepared and was no longer there to share. That is a particular kind of weight. It sits differently than the weight of scarcity. She knew both kinds and she did not rank them. When she came back in, she took off her coat and her boots and washed her hands and started supper. And she did not say anything about what she had thought about on the fence line, because some thoughts are not meant to be said aloud. Some thoughts do their work best when they are kept close and quiet, the way the fire does its work best when it is not opened. He came in from the barn, and she put a plate in front of him, and they ate without talking much, but it was a different kind of quiet than the first week. The first week it had been the quiet of 2 strangers being careful. This was the quiet of 2 people who had decided, without saying so, that they could afford to stop being careful. January came and stayed. She had lived through hard winters before and did not trouble herself about this one. But she watched the man and saw how the short days affected him, how the light that came through the windows in the late afternoon had a particular quality of going too fast, and how when it went, he went quiet in a different way than his ordinary quiet. She did not try to fix this. Some things are not meant to be fixed by another person. What she did was keep the house warm and the meals regular, and make sure there was always something on the table at the hour when the light changed, so that the moment when the dark came down was a moment of sitting together rather than a moment of sitting alone. This was not a calculated thing. It was just what you did for someone when you understood what they needed and had the means to provide it. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. He did not say anything about it directly. He said things around it, that the bread she made was better than anything he'd had since, and then he stopped himself, and she let him stop. He said that the cattle were looking well, which was true, and that the cows' quarter had cleared up entirely, which was also true. He said once that he thought they might come through winter in better shape than he'd expected. She said, I think so too. He said, that's partly you. She said, it's partly both of us. He looked out the window. He said, you could have gone to any number of places. She said, probably. He said, why here? She thought of the letter. The modest wage. Before the ground froze, the suggestion of urgency in a man who was not sure how to say he needed help. She said, the letter sounded like it was written by someone who had been managing alone for a long time. He did not say anything to that. But he did not look away from her either. She picked up her cup. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the snow was doing what snow does in Saskatchewan in January, which is everything. Spring came late, the way it does when winter has been serious about itself. The first real thaw was in the third week of March, and it came fast, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the fields going soft and gray-brown, the smell of mud and last year's grass returning to the air. She found it hard to explain why this always moved her, but it did. The return of the earth after the long covering of it, the evidence that the ground was still there, still capable. She planted the kitchen garden in the second week of April, working the soil first with the fork to break the crust, and then with the hand cultivator to work the deeper clay loose. And she planted it the way her grandmother had taught her, not in rows for the look of it, but in the order of the ground's drainage and the reach of the light, practical and unglamorous and effective. He came out one afternoon and watched her for a while. He said, that's more than last year. She said, the soil is better than it looks. It just needed to be asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Burrell came by last week when you were in town. She said, I know. Mabel Forsyth told me. He said, he asked me what the arrangement was. She kept working the soil. She said, what did you tell him? He said, I told him it was a working arrangement, and it wasn't his business beyond that. She said, that's accurate. He said, is that how you'd describe it? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, the way he stood when he was not sure what to do with them. The light in April was coming back in earnest, and it was on him sideways, and she could see the gray in his beard and the lines around his eyes and the way his left shoulder held. And she thought about all of the mornings and evenings that had accumulated between September and this moment. The bucket of milk set on the table, the fence walked, the ledger not opened, the bread said to be good. She said, I'd describe it as what it is. He said, and what's that? She said, 2 people getting a farm through winter, and now through spring, and we'll see about summer. He was quiet. Then he said, that's all right with you. She looked at him steadily. She said, I wouldn't still be here if it wasn't. Something passed across his face that she had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen and not named. She did not name it now. She turned back to the garden, and he stood there for another minute, and then he went back to whatever he had been doing. And she worked the soil until the light changed, and then she came inside and washed her hands and made supper, and they ate at the same table they had eaten at every night since September. By summer, the farm looked like itself again. Not like it had been before. She understood it had never been hers to restore to something she hadn't seen, but like what it was capable of being, which was considerable. The garden was producing beyond what she'd expected. The cattle were in good condition. The barn roof had come through winter without complaint. Burrell stopped by in June with his wife, a small and practical woman named Ida, who looked at the property with a clear eye and said she hadn't seen the place look this well in some time. She said this to the man, and she said it without looking at her, which was the kind of compliment that has to be interpreted. And she interpreted it as generous. A few other neighbors came that summer. A woman who lived 12 miles south named Prentice, who was looking to trade for seedlings, and ended up staying for 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee and told more stories about the district than could comfortably be followed. A young couple from across the highway who were new to the area and had questions about hay curing that she answered as clearly as she could. She found she liked this, the people of the district. The way knowledge moved between properties, practical and unglamorous, the same way water finds its level. She had not expected to find community here, or perhaps she had not expected to find herself willing to be part of one. She was not entirely sure which it was. In August, he asked her to stay on. They were in the barn, not doing anything in particular, checking the straw that had been delivered the day before. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without building up to it. He said, "I'd like you to stay on, if you're willing." She looked at the straw. She said, "I'd like to know what that means." "Stay on as what?" He said, "As whatever you want it to mean." She thought about this. She said, "That's a wide answer." He said, "I know. I'm not good at the narrow ones." She supposed that was honest. He had been honest with her, consistently, not in the way of a man performing honesty, but in the way of a man who finds dishonesty more trouble than it's worth. And she had found this reliable in the way that reliable things are valuable, quietly and without spectacle. She said, "I'll stay through fall, and we'll see about winter." He nodded once. She went back to checking the straw. He went back to whatever he had been doing before. The barn smelled of it, clean and dry and seasonal, and outside the August light was long and particular, the kind of light that knows it is ending and takes its time. She stayed through fall, and through the winter that followed it, which was harder than the first, the kind of winter that is not vicious, but is simply relentless, day after day of gray and cold, and the particular silence that settles on the prairies when the world has run out of things to say. She got through it the same way she got through everything, which is one thing at a time, not looking at the whole of it. Just the next morning and the next bucket and the next fence post and the next meal laid on the table. And he got through it too. There came a morning in February, late in February, the kind of morning that is still winter but has a quality to it that is something else underneath. And she was in the kitchen, and he came in from the barn, and he set his coat on the hook and sat down at the table, and she put coffee in front of him, and they sat in the kitchen that was warm now, that had been warm for months because she kept it warm, and through the window she could see the field she had walked the fence line of, and the root cellar she had taken inventory of, and the roof of the barn she had helped fix on a Sunday when the weather held. He said, "I want to show you something." She followed him out into the yard, into the cold, and around the side of the house to the east wall, where last summer's garden had been, and he had done something there that she had not noticed. He had built a cold frame, simple and solid, out of boards she recognized as the boards from the old wagon that had been propped on a stump for as long as she had been here. He had built it the right size and the right angle and caulked it properly against the cold. He said, "I thought you could start seeds earlier if you wanted." She looked at it for a long moment. She said, "You built this," he said, "over the winter, when it was too cold for anything else." She put her hand on the frame. The wood was smooth. It was well done. It was the work of a man who had decided he was going to do a thing and had done it carefully. She said, "It's good work," he said. "It's your garden. I thought you should have what you need for it." She did not say anything to that, but she stood there with her hand on the wood he had shaped and smoothed in the coldest months, and she thought, this is how it happens. Not in a moment, not in a declaration, in the slow accumulation of mornings and decisions and quiet evidence of a person paying attention to what another person needs. She thought, I have been paying attention for a long time, and I had stopped believing anyone was paying attention back. She did not say any of this. She said, "We should start with the tomatoes first. They need the longest season." He said, "All right." She said, "I'll need to order seeds from town." He said, "There's a list already started. I wasn't sure what variety you preferred." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with anything in particular. He was just looking at her, the way you look at a person you have been in a kitchen with for a year and a half and intend to be in a kitchen with for considerably longer. She said, "Show me the list." And they went back inside, out of the cold, into the kitchen that was warm and smelled of coffee and the morning. And the prairie lay flat and white and indifferent all around the house, and none of that mattered, and all of it did.